Stephanie Bullen from Dairy Australia, talking about Australian livestock industries tackling AMR together. Thanks, Stephanie.
Alrighty. And I have a slight change of pace. This is my 2-year-old daughter and her grandfather, my dad. Yes, I work for Dairy Australia. I've spent my career in the dairy industry, but don't hold that against me because my roots are on this Angus beef cattle property in Victoria. My 2-year-old Harriet, we're talking today about antibiotics. She's had 2 ear infections requiring antibiotics in her 2 years. My dad, her grandfather, is currently in remission from follicular lymphoma, which is a cancer that impacted all of his immune system, and the treatment that he had means that he's really, really high risk for infections, which is a problem when you live on a farm and you're feeding out silage and hay, and particularly in the drought situation that we've had in southwest Victoria over the last 12 to 18 months. It's really, really dusty, and so he suffers from chronic lung infections and requires antibiotics fairly regularly. These 2 people are the dearest people in my life, but having effective antibiotics is really critical to ensuring that they stay safe. And so today I'm going to talk about antibiotic resistance and the efforts that we can all play as stakeholders in the livestock industries to making sure that we protect antibiotics for ourselves in human health, but also for animals and for sustainable food production. Each year, around 10 million Australians receive a course of antibiotics. So I want to encourage you all to have a look around your tables. It's about 1 in 3 Australians. So around 1 in 3 of you, most of us are pretty healthy individuals here, so perhaps we're slightly underrepresented in this cohort, but that's 1 in 3 Australians receiving antibiotics in their lifetime. A little stat that I wasn't aware of that gave me a bit of a shock as I was preparing for this presentation, Jacob, is that Australian healthcare is one of the highest prescribers of antibiotics in the world, and that's actually in contrast to what we use in our livestock production systems, which is good for us, but it does suggest that there's a lot more work that we can be doing in terms of the use of antibiotics in ourselves and the prescribing practices. So the way antibiotic resistance works, and apologies for those of you that know this, I saw Stacey Ray is in the room from she's the president of the Australian Cattle Vets. This will be very boring for Stacey, but for some of this it might be new. Bacteria are present everywhere, so they're present on our skin, they're present in our guts, in our mouths, in our hair, and in our environment. And the way that antibiotics work is by targeting those specific bacteria that cause disease, or at least that's the intention. But when we expose bacteria to antibiotics, so the ones that cause disease, we're also exposing all of those other bacteria to antibiotics, so the bacteria in our guts and our skin, etc. So when we use an antibiotic, we kill those bacteria that cause disease, but also kill others. And the problem with that is that innately in the bacteria that are present everywhere, there's a small number of individuals in that population that carry genes that actually make them resistant to antibiotics. And they could be in the good bacteria on our skin or in our gut, or they could be in the bacteria that cause disease. And so when we use antibiotics, we kill all those bacteria that cause disease, ideally, if the antibiotics are working well. But those bacteria, whether they're good bacteria or bad bacteria, that carry resistant genes survive, and then they can go on to reproduce. And we end up with lots and lots more bacteria or other organisms that carry those resistant genes, and that's a problem. So when we've got when we carry those bacteria in our system, and here's a beautiful picture of myself on the screen, the risk is that we can transmit those resistant bacteria to others. So those of you that have received courses of antibiotics in the last 12 months, you can potentially transmit those bacteria to others. And that's a particular concern if we're exposed to people in those high-risk populations like my daughter and like my dad. We also transmit those bacteria into the environment, largely via wastewater systems, and so you can imagine the potential for transmission of antibiotic-resistant bacteria from hospital wastewater, from aged care wastewater. This is a real challenge. But one of the really interesting things about bacteria specifically is they have this little nifty genetic system called plasmid-mediated transmission, where good bacteria that carry antibiotic-resistant genes can actually pass on those resistant genetic material to bacteria that cause disease, such as Salmonella. And this occurs whether or not we're using antibiotics in human healthcare, whether we're using antibiotics in livestock production, whether we're using it in horticulture, and that's something that we often don't think about, is the use of fungicides and other chemicals to maintain plant health for sustainable food production. But every time we use antibiotics, we end up with increasing levels of antibiotic resistance, whether that's in these populations or in the environment, largely through wastewater. Why is that a problem? Here's a slightly sobering, result of modelling out of the EU. If we continue on our current trajectory and our use of antibiotics, the number of deaths globally attributed to antibiotic resistance is expected to surpass cancer by 2050. So that's 25 years' time. I think about my 2-year-old Harriet, and I think about what the world looks like for her when she's 25, 26, 27, and the fact that she's at a high risk of dying from antibiotic resistance, and she's from cancer. So that's why we need to take this issue really, really seriously. And Jacob, I've given a bit of an overview of the global context of antibiotic resistance, but the key part of my presentation is all the efforts that the livestock industries have been putting into making sure that we're really proactive in this space. So the Australian government recognises the importance of antimicrobial resistance and the efforts that we need to be taking to ensure we have a coordinated effort to address this issue. We've got a One Health Master Action Plan which oversees the key initiatives that all sectors, so whether that's in human healthcare, whether that's in agriculture, whether that's in wastewater management, the key activities that we need to be taking over the next 5 years to combat antimicrobial resistance. And then DAF, the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, has taken that One Health Master Action Plan and built it out further to identify the specific actions that the livestock sectors need to be taking in order to meet our obligations under that action plan. But we're actually starting from a pretty strong base in the livestock industries. Australia is one of the lowest users of antimicrobials internationally, so this is 29 countries. We're even below Denmark, which is often sort of heralded as, the baseline or where we want to aspire to be in terms of antimicrobial use in livestock. So Australia is pretty low. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we've obviously got really strict regulatory controls over veterinary medicines, but we're also really quite extensive in terms of our production systems, even in what would traditionally be known as more intensive systems, such as dairy production. So we're starting at a really good base, but we need to ensure that we protect our reputation there as low users and low risk for antimicrobial resistance. So talking about the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework, I was really pleased to see that in 2023, 100% of Australian beef feedlots were covered by an antimicrobial stewardship antimicrobial stewardship plan. Antimicrobial stewardship essentially means that we are taking steps to ensure that any time that we use antibiotics, we're using as little as possible, but as much as necessary to protect both the health and welfare of animals. And the people and the environments that may be impacted by our use. So that's what's happening in your industry, in the beef industry, but those commitments are shared in other industries as well. So both the pork sustainability framework and the dairy sustainability framework also have commitments around antimicrobial stewardship in efforts to combat the development of antibiotic resistance. And I think the reason why I was actually asked to speak is not because I work for Dairy Australia, but because I'm one of the founding members of the Animal Industries Antimicrobial Stewardship RD&E strategy. This group was established in 2018, and we got together to identify shared challenges around mitigating antimicrobial resistance and identify collaborative opportunities for investment to tackle this together. The founding members are MLA, Dairy Australia, Australian Pork Limited, Australian Eggs and AgriFutures, which represents the chicken meat industry. And we work really closely together on a regular basis, so we get together 4 times a year to address the the key initiatives that we can be tackling together and really leverage those opportunities. The work that we've done has been published in our Antimicrobial Stewardship in Australian Livestock Industries publications. We're up to our second version. This is available on the AIS website, so if you're interested to know what each of the livestock sectors are doing around antimicrobial stewardship, please feel free to jump in and have a look at this document. Recently, so within the last 12 months, we undertook a coordinated gap analysis against the animal sector AMR action plan to identify where the key gaps were remaining, really with the view to identifying where we could potentially be pooling our resources, acknowledging that levy resources are declining and getting tighter and tighter for all of us, so where can we really pool our efforts to make a difference here. And where we landed in terms of those gaps is that there's still opportunity to do further work around species level antibiotic use quantification. So at the moment we report antimicrobial use across all livestock sectors, but there are particular products such as oxytetracycline, penicillin and others that are used across multiple species, and so to be able to identify how the beef industry is tracking year on year or the pork industry is tracking year on year is still a gap that we are working on addressing together. Development of and access to effective vaccines is a shared issue across all of the industries, particularly given our tight regulatory systems here in Australia, but also the Australian market is really small on a global scale. So if we want to get access to the vaccines that, say, the US industry has access to, it's really, really challenging for those pharmaceutical companies to identify, you know, the potential business case to come here and to overcome those regulatory hurdles, because we're a pretty small industry. And that's irrespective of whether we're talking about beef, dairy, pork, chickens, etc. Each of the livestock industries has been self-funding surveillance for antimicrobial resistance, just to track how we're going, and the really good news is that we've got really low levels of antimicrobial resistance coming out of the livestock industries, but that's really, really expensive, and so having coordinated and sustainably funded surveillance is a priority for us so that we can reduce the reliance on levy funds to do this and utilise more of the external funding that's available to enable us to tell our story on the good work that we're doing. And finally, access to rapid diagnostic technologies is something that some of the industries are progressing along with. Certainly we've got more and more of these coming to the market for dairy. But the ability for veterinarians and farmers to be able to better target their antimicrobial use through these diagnostics that are available either on farm or in clinic can help us to further improve our antibiotic use. And finally, really excitingly, in 2023, the CRC for Solving Antimicrobial Resistance in Agribusiness, Food and Environments, which is SAFE CRC, was established, and they're investing over $150 million into collaborative research to tackle the big issues around AMR in both livestock and wastewater. So that's really exciting to see that funding come to the forefront. So really quick whirlwind tour of AMR, and I guess I just wanted to bring it back to that original message. The reason why we care and the reason why we need to do stuff is so that we've got continued access to safe and effective antibiotics for people like my dad, for my daughter and for your families, but also to make sure that we can maintain the welfare of the animals that we care for and make sure that we've got sustainable food production into the future. So that's it. Thanks, Jacob.